We've heard many Republicans argue that this president ran as a uniter, and now he's calling MAGA Republicans, which is a very large swath of the American populace, semi-fascists. He is arguing that they're a threat to democracy. Does the White House believe that this is a fair criticism by Republicans, that this is not unifying language?
Sadly, there are more examples than I can count on how we have seen recently armed attacks on federal law enforcement. You have Representative Paul Gosar has posted videos depicting him attacking the president and members of Congress. You have Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene has publicly expressed support for shooting prominent Democratic elected officials and suggesting physically assaulting transgender school officials. You have Representative Madison Cawthorn has said falsely.
I'll tell you, anybody who tells you that Joe Biden was dutifully elected is lying.
If our election systems continue to be rigged and continue to be stolen, then it's going to lead to one place, and it's bloodshed.
And just last week, you had Governor Ron DeSantis suggested that Dr. Fauci should be physically assaulted.
Someone needs to grab that little elf and chuck him across the Potomac.
As right-wing rhetoric escalates, so do threats and violence. And so these are things that we have to call out.
President Biden finally said what we've all been saying for quite some time, that the Republican Party has devolved into fascism. I'm Yasmin Khan with Rebel HQ, and Joe Biden recently made a statement at a private fundraiser likening MAGA Republican ideology to, quote, semi-fascism. He said, quote, "What we're seeing now is either the beginning or the death knell of extreme MAGA philosophy. It's not just Trump. It's the entire philosophy that underpins the, I'm going to say something, it's like semi-fascism." He went on to say, quote, "I underestimated how much damage the previous 4 years had done in terms of America's reputation in the world." Of course, Republicans aren't too happy about what was said about them. They criticized the president for campaigning on a platform of unity, but his language, they say, is not unifying. To be clear, they chose to frame President Biden as a hypocrite, picking apart his language rather than attempting to engage in any kind of actual self-reflection. Now, when asked about this at a press briefing, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre supported the president's statements, and she went a little bit further, offering several examples of semi-fascist rhetoric that we've already seen from members of the Republican Party, citing examples from Paul Gosar, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Madison Cawthorn, Ron DeSantis, and Trump himself. In response, the GOP spokesperson said, quote, "Biden forced Americans out of their jobs, transferred money from hardworking families to Harvard lawyers, and sent our country into a recession while families can't afford gas and groceries." Now, none of that was actually relevant to the topic at hand, and on top of that, it was dumb and hyperbolic. It's like, sure, Biden, the president who created 9 million jobs in his first 17 months in office, the most of any other president in the same time frame, the same president who achieved a 3.6% unemployment rate, the same president who saw the lowest number of Americans making initial unemployment claims in over 50 years. Yeah, sure, that guy forced Americans out of their jobs, whatever you say.
It's not just Trump, it's the entire philosophy that underpins the, I'm going to say something, it's like semi-fascism. That's a quote. In a campaign event before his fundraiser, Biden pointed his attack squarely on former President Trump.
In 2020, you and 81 million Americans voted to save our democracy. That's why Donald Trump isn't just a former president, he is a defeated former president.
Now, Biden didn't say anything that the rest of us haven't been saying for years, but his status as the president means that he has to be more deliberate in his words because his words are worth so much more than the rest of ours, even collectively. And remember, his declaration comes nearly 2 years after we saw these MAGA Republicans storm and riot our Capitol, breaking windows, attacking Capitol Police with American flagpoles, making direct threats against members of Congress, and taunting the vice president with gallows, all in the name of Jesus and Trump, all at Trump's behest. Now, for the rest of us, we saw and heard the things they were saying and doing for years. The Capitol insurrection shouldn't have come as a surprise to anyone. We remember the Trumpy white supremacists with their tiki torches in Charlottesville back in 2017, the same group of people that the then president refused to condemn or distance himself from. We remember every time Trump disparaged nearly every imaginable minority group, both before and after he was elected president. And we remember all of the people who voted for him even after he made all of those disparaging statements while he was on the 2016 campaign trail. And we remember even less forgivingly the people who voted for him a second time 4 years later. Now, as far as I'm concerned, there is no distinction anymore between traditional Republicans and MAGA Republicans. They're all the same. Some of them are just less outwardly ridiculous and inflammatory than others, but they all support the same guy and the same party and the same rhetoric and the same beliefs. At the end of the day, the ballot doesn't make a distinction between the two groups of Republicans, so I don't either. But back to fascism. With fascism, the perception is that we got fascists on the right and anti-fascists on the left. When Antifa became a thing, they quickly became a target for right-wing media and political figures. And while you can argue that they were actually against the group and not necessarily the group's ideology, it's always been at least semantically funny that the right declared themselves the anti-fascists without actually embracing fascism out loud. Now, whenever I think of fascism, the first thing that comes to my mind is the movie Hot Fuzz, when a big-time London cop gets reassigned to a quaint village in the English countryside, and the innkeeper, sort of indirectly, calls him a fascist on his first night in town. And that's a part of it. Cops and police forces, to a lot of people, represent and perpetuate fascism in the sense that they are agents of the state that use force to bend people to the state's will. Incessant documented examples of police brutality and corruption and racism within police departments don't help to ease the stigma against fascist police in this country. It also doesn't help that the overwhelming majority of American cops are avid Trump supporters. According to data from the Federal Election Commission, as reported in the Washington Post, quote, in 2016, there were about 7,000 contributions from police. In 2020, there were more than 46,000, totaling more than $2.75 million. 78% of those contributions went to the Republican Party, a huge increase from previous election cycles. Beyond that, we also saw police unions across the country publicly endorsing Trump. An NYPD officer was chanting Trump 2020 through the loudspeaker of his squad car as he drove through Brooklyn. And a Miami cop was wearing a Trump 2020 mask to an early voting site. Even more explicitly, though, the leader of the Oath Keepers confessed that they were being trained and supported by cops. There's even video to corroborate his claim. Still, despite this love affair between cops and the GOP, the Capitol Police that attempted to stop Trump's mob from entering the Capitol at enormous personal cost didn't receive the same amount of respect or support from right-wing media and political figures. If there were any good apples in law enforcement, it was those Capitol Police, but they weren't the ones being celebrated by the party of law and order. Let's back up a bit, though. When it comes to ideologies as broad as something like fascism, it helps to distinguish what fascism actually is as a philosophy from how the term is commonly used today, and I will try to do so briefly without launching into an entire history/philosophy lesson. Whenever a term is overused in media or pop culture and it's adopted into the common national vernacular, it often gets conflated with all kinds of things. And especially when it's a political ideology or philosophy, the term can become absorbed as part of a partisan docket of beliefs, for better or for worse. So the dictionary definition of fascism is, quote, a political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual, and that stands for a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. Or it's, quote, a tendency toward or actual exercise of strong autocratic or dictatorial control. So right off the bat, the concept of fascism seems to contradict the Republican Party's core platform. They are the party of small government, whereas the Democrats tend to champion bigger government. However, as most of us have seen, and as most of us understand, the Republican Party of today says one thing but does an entirely different thing in practice. For instance, stacking the court system and imposing archaic religious beliefs on a populace that believes in the separation of church and state feels like an overstep into people's private lives from a purportedly small government, pro-personal freedom advocacy group. On top of that, you have the rights embrace of Donald Trump, a president who went out of his way to befriend and ally himself with dictators around the world while alienating his nation from its traditional allies. He frequently berates and diminishes minority groups while amplifying white nationalistic rhetoric and public figures, something he actually has a long history of doing. He's supportive of using police forces and the military against the American people, and he's embraced the Back the Blue and Blue Lives Matter movements, which are generally understood by its critics to be fear-driven, racist, and authoritarian, despite masquerading as a blue-collar movement. And then, of course, he tried to steal the 2020 election via coup, first by intimidation and then by force, while claiming he was actually trying to stop Joe Biden from stealing it. Looking at what fascism was first conceptualized as, you can kind of see how he got here. The Italian philosopher Giovanni Gentile, who ghostwrote A Doctrine of Fascism for Benito Mussolini, was highly nationalistic and sought to incorporate that nationalism into his system of government. He liked Marx, but he didn't like the idea of class struggle, and he didn't like the inequality that tended to come with capitalism. Instead, he believed that all aspects of the state should be united under the umbrella of the government, which in theory was supposed to operate in accordance with the culture and preferences of the people. This meant that things like workers' unions and private businesses should be remade into government-controlled entities in such a way that industry and government were one and the same. The question of free will comes up a lot in fascist discussions, though. In Gentile's idealized fascism, liberty is not the individual's right, but rather the state's right, and that the individual is an indistinguishable part of the state. The state has freedom of movement and thought, and the individuals that comprise the state are expected to fall in line to support the state. Already, there are some flaws in that system. For one, there is no healthy competition amongst businesses, which can lead to exploitative and corrupt business practices. When unions are also controlled by the government, there's little room for negotiation between workers and business leaders. Also, should the state decide to sway in one direction or the other in its ideologies or policies, opposition from individuals who are reluctant to get on board with the shifts would be incompatible with the system. This, as we've seen, has led to the oftentimes violent suppression of dissension carried out by state-run police forces and military. And probably the most frequently cited criticism of fascism is that the head of state wields an immense amount of power to impose those aforementioned shifts on the populace, even in governments that have a system of checks and balances in place. In this way, the term fascism tends to be used synonymously with authoritarianism and dictatorship. Mussolini infamously took Gentile's ideas and ran with them, embracing the use of force and violence as a means of imposing one's will on others. He was also fiercely nationalistic to the extent that he sought to make Italy an isolated and insular society. In Gentile's depiction of fascism, the racism that's present in the term's modern dictionary definition wasn't actually a primary component of the ideology. Still, Mussolini allied himself with Hitler and his anti-Semitic white supremacist Nazis. Today, racism and racial supremacy are almost indistinguishable, if veiled, aspects of nationalism and fascism. So I will leave you with that, and you can come to your own conclusions as far as whether or not today's GOP is actually fascist. Discuss amongst yourselves in the comment sections, but that is it for me. Please like and subscribe if you got something out of this, and be sure to follow me over on Instagram and TikTok. Thank you for being here.